Welcome everybody to the second lecture in the 2021 series of Green Templeton Lectures. My name is Marshall Young and I am an Emeritus Fellow at Green Templeton College and I am chairing the lectures this year. The background to these lectures is quite simple. Like most Oxford colleges, Green Templeton hosts numerous lectures throughout the year that address the specialist academic interests of its professors and students. However, each year, the college picks a theme of contemporary interests and then arranges 3 lectures aimed at a broader audience of interested but non-specialist parties from outside the college. This year, the pandemic is an inescapable contemporary theme. After almost a year, as of early 2021, the world is still in the grip of the COVID-19 pandemic. Governments around the world are still scrambling to contain the impact of the pandemic. The public interventions they have had to undertake have had major knock-on effects on their economies, thus giving citizens major economic as well as major health worries. One notable feature of the pandemic is that as citizens try to make sense of how the pandemic is progressing, and more particularly, how effectively their governments are managing its impact on their lives, they have been subject to a tsunami of conflicting commentary. This has come from scientists, journalists, pundits of different hues, and of course politicians. So Green Templeton, drawing on its research base in medicine, public policy and management, decided to use this latest lecture series to try to provide an opportunity for the intelligent non-specialist to stand back and reflect on some of the deeper issues the frenetic experience of the last 12 months has raised. In particular, what are some of the key questions they should have for their governments when they come up with the inevitable Build Back Better plans for recovering from COVID? Under the overall title of Navigating the COVID Challenge, the series comprises 3 lectures that explore different aspects of this challenge that range from framing the coronavirus challenge to key lessons for recovery strategies to measuring the actual progress towards a better future that these strategies deliver. Green Templeton College is delighted that these 2021 lectures are being supported by the Franklin Templeton Investment Institute, the research group within the fund manager Franklin Templeton. And yes, the Templeton that features in both our names does refer to the same Sir John Templeton, the renowned investor and philanthropist. The first lecture, which involved 2 talks, addressed the topic of framing the COVID challenge. This highlighted the need for governments to fully understand the environment in which their Build Back Better plans must operate. In particular, the need to distinguish the factors governments interface with directly from the driving forces that govern these factors. So in her talk, Professor Trudy Lang clearly identified the portfolio of public health, clinical and pharmaceutical interventions that any effective system for managing pandemics, what has been termed a playbook, must encompass. She also pointed out some major issues that COVID has highlighted at this level. Then Professor Rafael Ramirez, in his talk, highlighted the importance of also looking to the wider socio-technical economic context that determines the nature and scope of the interventions that need to be included in the playbook. He suggested that scenario planning is one of the few approaches that can handle the complexity and uncertainty that this contextual level involves. It offers a perspective that highlights some of the basic tensions, such as the trade-off between resilience and efficiency, that government policies must address. Today we move on to our second lecture, which looks to the lessons from COVID that governments need to take on board if their strategies for building back better are to be credible and effective. I am delighted we have been able to arrange for Dr. Giulio Boccaletti to give this second lecture. We have provided a copy of his impressive CV on the web pages describing these lectures, so I will not list all his achievements, but I will just note that over the past 2 decades, his career has spanned academia, the private and not-for-profit sectors. He started out as a physicist and climate scientist working at Bologna, Princeton and MIT. He left academia to join McKinsey & Company, where he became a partner involved in its sustainability practice. And then he moved on to the Nature Conservancy, the largest environmental conservation organization in the world, where he became the chief strategy officer. He therefore brings an unusual breadth of experience to the task we have asked him to address tonight, namely to reflect on the lessons COVID might have for governments as they develop their recovery strategies. Welcome, Giulio. Very glad to have you here, and we're all looking forward to your perspective on this very complex but crucial problem. Giulio.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marshall. And well, it's a real pleasure to be with you today. I want to thank Green Templeton College for the kind invitation, as well as Franklin Templeton, and particularly Dustin Garrick, who suggested I do this lecture in the first place from the Smith School at Oxford. So if I could have the slides up, let me just start. Originally, the lecture was supposed to be titled "Key Lessons from COVID for Recovery Strategies," but I decided to be slightly less ambitious and talk about 3 lessons from COVID that I, upon reflection, sort of drew from the last year or so. And let me start here, because it's fair to say that COVID shows that we are capable of remarkable responses to a crisis. This is a graph from the National Audit Office of the UK. And you can see that it spans sort of the last year or so. And you can see that when March came along and we realized that COVID was an emergency, within a couple of weeks, the government was able to mobilize on the order of £100 billion in resources. Within a couple of months, it was up to £200 billion, and it's been growing since. So it's fair to say that this has been an extraordinarily fast and extraordinarily wide response, and the UK sort of mirrors the response that's happened in many other parts of the world. And so it's fair to ask whether this is, in fact, the model that we should be following to respond to all sorts of crises. And many of you will know that we've been talking about the climate crisis, the environmental crisis. And so is this a way to think about what we ought to expect of the state in response to crises that we are confronting, existential crises like COVID, but also the environmental crisis that we face. The reason this is particularly relevant is because, of course, countries over the last several months have committed to spending enormous resources, both to respond to the immediate shock of this exogenous problem, but then also to rebuild, to respond to the inevitable economic crisis that we're already entering in, and that is likely to follow from such an enormous shock. And so you can see here, compiled by Vivid Economics, some of the, as of February 2021, some of the big sort of promises in stimulus packages that have been made by a number of countries. First and foremost, of course, the United States. There's a $1.9 trillion package that just passed a couple of days ago with the House in the US, going on to the Japan, to EU, and a number of other countries. And of course, it's legitimate to ask how this money should be spent. And a number of leaders have made the point that, as Marshall said earlier, we should be rebuilding back better, or building back better. This is a quote from a couple of days ago from the outgoing Secretary General of the OECD, Angel Gurria, the former Minister of Finance for Mexico. And he says, 2021 brings renewed hope for action, but COVID-19 recovery packages need to be green. So COVID provides a model for an emergency response, and as we respond, many are calling for investments in a more sustainable economy and using this as an opportunity to shift the economy to greater sustainability. Okay. Now, how are we doing in that purpose? Well, turns out we're not maybe doing necessarily all that well. This is work that was compiled again by Vivid Economics, but it's also related to work that's been going on at Oxford in a number of departments, including work led by Cameron Hepburn at the Smith School. And, it's a difficult exercise to go through, but if you sort of crudely review the promises that are made in these stimulus packages, you discover that just under a third of the money that's going to be spent, the $15 trillion that we've so far committed to, under a third of that is devoted to anything that is remotely connected to environmental issues, whether it's agriculture or fossil fuel industries and the likes. But when you actually look at the detail, Vivid concludes that a number of these packages are actually, on balance, making a negative contribution rather than a positive contribution to the transition to a sustainable economy. So if you then look at, so if you take back, and you look at our response from COVID, and you again look at the response of the UK, and then you ask, well, how does this compare to our usual efforts to transition to a sustainable economy? And you put on here global expenditures that are related to some of these sustainability themes. It starts being revealing. So, for example, the world in 2019 spent about 90 billion pounds on global biodiversity, as an example, right? That is less than what the UK government, individual country, was able to mobilize in a couple of weeks. Think of the ODA flows, right? This is the money that the developed countries' official development assessments. So the money that gets spent in developing and least developed countries to help countries adjust to a variety of economic and environmental issues. Well, that's only about 110 billion pounds. And then you look at the global carbon markets, and you discover that even those are around 150 billion pounds. And so less than what a single government facing COVID was able to mobilize in a couple of months. So the rhetoric of crisis and the focus on green then seems to be difficult to match with the actual mobilization of resources. And if COVID is a model, then how do we get to this kind of response as we rebuild our economies? Now, it may appear that the problem is fundamentally a matter of political will. Just recently, a couple of days ago, Sir David Attenborough spoke to the UN Security Council, and he said, if we continue on our current path, we will face the collapse of everything that gives us our security. You'd think that if we took these words at face value, we'd be able to respond to the environmental and sustainability crisis with the same impetus that we've been able to show for COVID, and thus all the sort of rhetoric around trying to increase the urgency. But is it really just about urgency? And this is where I began reflecting, and in preparation for this conversation, I captured 3 lessons that I think COVID teaches us about response. And so let me start with the first one. The first lesson, I think, is that emergency actually requires accountability. In order to understand what I mean here, let me just remind us what it is that we're trying to do whilst we rebuild the economy. You can tell this story in many ways. I've been working in sort of sustainability issues for the better part of 2 decades now, and effectively, at the risk of being too simplistic, I would say, we are trying to eliminate anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases, of course, carbon being by far the biggest, but not the only one. We're trying to effectively adapt modern society to a changing climate. We know that we are committed to some degree of climate change, and we'll have to adjust to changing conditions. And then, of course, we're trying to do all of that whilst avoiding the collapse of the planet's biodiversity and ecosystems in a pretty straightforward application of the principle that says that we ought to try and save our biodiversity because we probably depend on it. Now, if you listen to the rhetoric and the stories that get told about this problem of transitioning an economy, you tend to get the sense that this is a technology story. Some of you may have seen the latest book that Bill Gates put out. It's How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, which is essentially a compendium of interventions that are technology-based. Not surprising, Bill Gates is a technologist. But this is true of most reports and most publications that talk about the transition. Ultimately, they are pathways that are fundamentally technology pathways. This is an example from the Energy Transition Commission, and you typically get a long list of technologies that need to be implemented for society to be able to go on this transition. And don't get me wrong, these perspectives are not wrong, and I think that technology and technological substitution plays a fundamental role in the transition to a more sustainable economy. It's likely going to occupy a significant chunk of the resources that we will be spending to build back better. But I don't think this is the end of the story. I don't think that the problem of building back better can be just reduced to a technological issue. Because fundamentally, what we're actually going to have to do is transform the surface of the planet, right? And let me describe what I mean by that. If you think about mitigation of carbon emissions, for example, the transition of the energy economy to to low carbon. Well, it turns out that this transition will be landscape intensive, right? We're going to build wind farms. We're going to build concentrated solar power. We're going to, maybe go back to growing some degree of biofuels. And all of these activities are landscape intensive. This shouldn't be terribly surprising, because what we're doing is essentially taking fossil fuels, which were effectively millions of years of sunlight concentrated and fossilized in one place, and substituting it for technologies like wind or solar, which use the sunlight any day over large landscapes. And this is work that Joe Kiesecker, a former colleague of mine, did, and shows that if you were to develop these technologies to their full potential, you actually have a pretty significant landscape impact. But that's not the only part of the carbon and fossil fuel mitigation story, because it turns out that all of our emissions happen on a background of natural cycles. The carbon cycle is the natural carbon cycle of the planet is multiples of the net emissions that we are putting into the atmosphere, and part of that cycle is also vast stocks of carbon, in particular terrestrial carbon, that are held in forests and in the soils of the world. And so, we can't really mitigate carbon emissions without also worrying about the fact that we need to keep carbon into the ground, and therefore, forest conservation, and therefore forest restoration, regenerative agriculture, and so forth, so on. So even if you're talking about the most technological transition of all, which is the transition of the energy system, you're still talking about a pretty landscape-intensive set of issues. Now, if you go to adaptation, same story. In the end, it becomes a transformation of the landscape. This is an example. It's a map that shows the change in stream flow from a 2-degree increase in temperature, as modeled by a number of climate models, climate and hydrological models around the world. It's from the IPCC. And you can see that the blue colors tell you that there's an increase in stream flow and the red colors decrease. Now, if, let's say, Southern Europe, let's take Spain or Southern Italy or Greece, end up having such a reduction in water availability that they end up facing climate conditions that are more similar to today's Libya, for example, then you can imagine that will require investments in water infrastructure. It might require changes to agriculture. It will fundamentally require changes to what the landscape looks like. And then, of course, if we go to our third objective, which is to do all of this whilst preserving the biodiversity of the planet, then you look at where we are today. This is a map of human modification index. So it tells you where ecosystems have been affected by human activity. And the conclusion you draw from this is that already today, 84% of ecosystems around the world have been modified to some degree by human activity already. And so whatever we end up doing on the landscape needs to take into account the fact that we need to kind of preserve whatever is left. And this is where discussions about the half Earth and rewilding kind of come in, which again are sort of fundamentally interventions in the landscape. Okay, so when politicians talk about building back better, they're really talking about acts of investments and acts of sovereignty on the landscape at a minimum, right? And so, for example, here you see a quote from Joe Biden on the backdrop of his Build Back Better slogan. He says, just like we need a unified national response to COVID-19, we desperately need a unified national response to the climate crisis. So this theme that says, well, the COVID response, that enormous mobilization of resources that I started with, represents a model, but it represents a model of unified national response. And the keywords here are unified national response. I think there is in this thinking the theme that this is actually about our expectations of our nations and of our states and their ability to effect change, not just in technology, but over their landscape and ultimately exercise sovereignty over their territories. And so transformation, this is to me the first lesson that I take out of reflecting on the analogy with COVID. Transformation of the kind that we're describing when we think about rebuilding and rebuilding sustainably will require sovereignty over territory and state accountability. And so this leads to some profoundly important questions which COVID has in a way answered. So what are the principles that guide such sovereign action? Well, in the case of COVID, they are, of course, the principles of epidemiology that have guided science-based decision-making and evidence-based decision-making for most governments around the world. If you ask what are the mechanisms for delivery, what are the mechanisms through which that sovereignty and accountability is delivered and managed? Well, in the case of COVID, of course, it's the public health system, which is an extremely granular and dendritic system that pervades society, certainly in the UK and in most countries. And then, crucially, what is the source of state authority to do all of that? Because many of us are speaking from home here in the UK. We're under lockdown. Over the last year, we've experienced significant limitations to our liberties, and this all has happened without any significant protests because we live in a social contract that places public health at the heart of our living together. And so what does that look like when you're talking about sustainability, when you're talking about a transformation of the landscape? Okay, so that's the first lesson. Second lesson, history matters. Again, at the risk of stating the obvious, history matters. And what I thought I'd do is I'd give you a few examples that were provoked by my reflections on COVID. And I want to start here on the origins of public health. Where did these principles, these institutions, and this kind of social contract come from? And so here we go back to 1850 London. This is a sort of a pseudo aerial view from the time, from 1851. And remember, this is London at the height of the British Empire. At this point, this was the capital of an empire that commanded just under a quarter of the world's output, and it had benefited from over a century of industrialization by this point. But of course, that economic transformation had come with very significant costs, and this is an equally famous picture of the Great Stink. It's from the Punch. It's a Punch cartoon. It's from the Punch magazine, and it shows the Great Stink. I mean, the city had become essentially unlivable. The Thames had turned into an open sewer. In fact, a few years later, the embankment and the sewers of the embankment would be constructed. And so, this incredible industrial success had, in fact, created a public health crisis in an echo of what, in a way, some might argue we are experiencing today. Now, the story, the birth of epidemiology, those principles that have guided the COVID response, start effectively here. It's obviously a more complicated story than this one, but the sort of the short version of the story of epidemiology starts with this important milestone and this character, John Snow, who in the early 1850s wrote this pamphlet called on the Mode of Communication of Cholera. Cholera was one of the most problematic diseases to hit London at the time. There were numerous outbreaks, and it was thought at the time that cholera was a miasmic disease. In other words, it was transmitted through air, a bit like malaria was thought to be transmitted through bad air. But Snow had hypothesized that, in fact, that wasn't the case, and that cholera was, in fact, transmitted through contaminated water. And he famously produced this map. This map showed up in the second edition of that volume, and it reflected an exercise that he engaged in, which was a statistical exercise to try and map the victims of an outbreak on a street plan of the location of the outbreak. This is in 1854. Snow was working in southern London at the time. He was working in Vauxhall. He was also an anesthesiologist, and so he was mostly dealing with anesthetics, but he had this interest in the statistics of disease. And while he was working in southern London, this outbreak happened in Soho, in central London, a place that hadn't been affected before. And so he went in and mapped out where the disease was happening. He pretty quickly concluded that the problem was originated at 40 Broad Street, where there was a house next to which there was a pump that the whole neighborhood was drawing water from. This was a pump that was particularly well known for its water quality. So Snow hypothesized that the problem was contaminated water from the pump. He then worked with a sewers engineer to figure out what was going on in the house next door. And he realized that these are two sections, a horizontal section, a vertical section of the house. And he realized that the well, which I'm showing you here in red in kind of a horizontal and vertical section, was actually right next to the connection that the house had to the general sewers. And in fact, in the vertical section, you can see that the pipe that brought the wastewater from the back kitchen of the house into the sewer was traveling very, very close to the well. Well, it turns out that in this house, just before the outbreak happened, a family had had a tragedy. A small child, a girl, a few months old, had died of diarrheal diseases, and the mother had washed the soiled nappies in the wash basin that was in the kitchen at the back of the house. The water then went through the duct into the sewers, but it turned out that the pipe wasn't well insulated. And so some of the water made its way into the well and contaminated the water. And over time, people drew water from the well, and eventually the disease spread. Snow made the case. Eventually, the local council was convinced. They removed the handle of the pump, and the outbreak subsided, although in fact, Snow thought that the outbreak was already subsiding by itself. But this story actually encapsulates the birth of using sort of statistical information to try and detect and then infer causation for health outcomes, for disease. Now, this kind of realization that water was an important contributor to public health was crucial. It took a while. John Snow died in 1858, and it would take a few years for this idea to actually gain traction. At the time, water was being delivered by multiple private water companies, and it turned out that people noticed that, in fact, depending on which source of water the company was using, whether the water was inside the city or outside, public health outcomes were very, very different. And so in 1866, a Royal Commission for Water Supply was set up, and people started doing an inventory across England to try and find external, non-urban sources of water that people could draw on to supply to citizens of London, but also of Manchester, Birmingham, and all the other cities that had been affected. So a public health crisis provoked by industrialization and economic development had gotten authorities to turn their gaze towards the landscape and try and see if they could find sources of water that they could impound to deliver clean water to cities and to urban dwellers. Now, as it turns out, one of those particular places was this one, Lake Thirlmere in the Lake District. This is a picture before the impoundment actually happened. The Manchester Corporation for Water Supply decided this was a perfect place to draw water for the city of Manchester, and so they decided to turn it into a reservoir and build a very long aqueduct, one of the longest aqueducts in the world at the time, to bring the clean water of Lake Thirlmere from the Lake District down to Manchester. But what happened was that the local community and a number of local residents opposed this plan. Why? Because Lake Thirlmere was actually a place considered by the Victorians a place of incredible natural beauty and cultural value. In fact, this was the place where Wordsworth and Coleridge spent time. It was even a sort of kind of a secular sanctum. And there was this stone, the Rock of Words, where Wordsworth, Coleridge, and their friends had incised their initials. Wordsworth had written The Wagoner, inspired by this place. So it was for the Victorians, this was a really important place. And so this need to develop the landscape for the water security of cities confronted the desire of those who lived in the landscape to actually maintain it in a state of what the Victorians would have thought of as nature. And so a public health crisis leads the government to look to the landscape, and then in the landscape, it encounters conflict. Now, as it turns out, in this case, Manchester was able to develop the site, but the result was actually the foundation of the National Trust. It was the response to this problem was then the realization that you needed an institution to protect and set aside places of natural beauty and historical importance, and that's where the National Trust starts. And there's a wonderful book by the American historian Harriet Ritvo that tells this story and names it The Dawn of Green, because this is effectively where the conservation movement starts. Now, this is not a story that's limited to the Lake Districts of the UK, many other places in the world function this way. This is a map of the water supply of New York City in America. And you can see New York gets its water from the Catskills, from a beautifully protected, impounded lake up in the Catskills, about 200 kilometers away from New York, which is then gravity fed to Manhattan and supplies water to that city. This scheme was developed a couple of decades after Lake Thirlmere, but this is a kind of a common theme. So this idea that ultimately the challenges of industrialization lead to public health issues in urbanization, which then lead you to contemplate the landscape. Now, there's a next step in this story, which is an important step for our story and for the story of COVID, which is about 2 decades later, and it's the New Deal. The New Deal has arrived. It's 1932. Franklin Delano Roosevelt wins the election, takes over from Hoover, and in 1933, sworn in March, 2 months later than what it is today, is sworn in as the President of the United States. And with remarkable speed, he wades into the crisis that was ongoing and that started with the crash of 1929. Now, Roosevelt sets up a number of institutions in response to the crisis. Some of them are still around today. The Social Security Administration, for example, the Works Progress Administration. And crucially, on May 18th, 1933, he signs the Tennessee Valley Authority Act. And this is a particularly important institution and a particularly important event for our story. The Tennessee Valley is a big river. The Tennessee is a big river. It's a tributary of the Ohio River, which then goes into the Mississippi River. It covers 7 states, and it was in a very impoverished part of the United States at the time. The reason Roosevelt was focused on the Tennessee River is that at the time, electrification of rural communities was a real problem. Electrification hadn't reached most of the people that lived in rural communities. And part of the reason was that electricity production was monopolized by a number of large private entities. And Roosevelt felt that he needed the state to develop a number of utilities, large utilities, that could provide a benchmark price for the electrification, thus breaking that monopoly. Now, you have to remember that in the 1930s, the dominant technology for power production was hydropower. And so what he proposed was the development of 4 grand utilities that were river basin scales. One would be in the Tennessee Valley, this one here. Then he would have one in the St. Lawrence River in the northeast of the country, one in the Columbia River in the northwest of the country, and one in the Colorado River in the southwest of the country. And he started with the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Tennessee Valley Authority Act. So it was an economic development and energy intervention, but it was also a public health intervention because conditions of those who lived in the Tennessee Valley were of abject poverty and exposed to enormous amounts of public health issues. This is a family that was moved as part of the process of developing the TVA. You have problems of silicosis, of pellagra, of malnourishment, you name it. Roosevelt established this institution that was going to develop the entire river as an individual system and that would deliver both public health outcomes as well as electricity and economic development. And he described it himself as a corporation clothed with the power of government, but possessed of the flexibility and initiative of a private enterprise, words that have since become quite popular. And in a way, the Tennessee Valley was a success. This is a picture of one of its first directors on the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, David Lilienthal. And Lilienthal subsequently became the chairman of the TVA. And it was such a success that it became sort of an archetype for the kind of liberal institution, the response to the central planning of the Soviets. It was the liberal response to how you use the power of the state to respond to an economic development crisis. In fact, Lilienthal wrote a book called Democracy on the March, which is a sort of political pamphlet almost, and he speaks of this powerful state that exercises planning and engages the grassroots. He uses this term, the grassroots, in a kind of collective governance of this important national asset. Now, in reality, the TVA politically was in many ways a disaster. In fact, the plan that Roosevelt had of delivering this institution in multiple parts of the United States never came to fruition. The opposition from a number of senators of the various neighboring states to the reproduction of the Tennessee Valley Authority experience was enormous. And in fact, it was never done again in the US. So despite the fact that it had very significant regional impact, although in truth the national impact of the TVA is a little more, it's a little less clear. But despite the fact that it did transform locally the conditions of people living in the Tennessee Valley, it was felt it was an enormous overreach of federal power that broke the constitutional compact that held the Union together. And so it was actually never repeated. However, it was incredibly successful internationally. 11 million people over the course of the Tennessee Valley's development visited this site. And one of the byproducts of this story was the proliferation of valley authorities all over the place. I worked in Jordan at one point. There's a Jordan Valley Authority, which was inspired exactly by this experience. There's an Awash Valley Authority in Ethiopia, and so forth, and so on. And in fact, this modernist idea of development, the idea that you could take state power and invest in the landscape and transform the landscape in service of public health and economic development, took off. And as a result, particularly between the 1940s and the 1990s, we essentially replumbed the planet. This is a picture of the cumulative water reservoir storage that we built in the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, we were essentially incapable of storing much water at all. The biggest dam in the world was the Lower Aswan Dam, which is a masonry dam that the British had built. By the time you get to the 1970s and 80s, we've essentially constructed enough infrastructure to catch 20%, almost 20% of the entire planet's runoff. Right? It's a remarkable global transformation of the face of the planet. And in many ways, it's still going on today. The Three Gorges Dam, which is an enormous piece of infrastructure that was built on the Yangtze, commissioned during Li Peng's premiership, and then ultimately opened in 2009, is the largest dam in the world and created a 600-kilometer impoundment, transforming the Yangtze and the landscape around it. And remember, the Three Gorges Dam, the original project, the first original project for the Three Gorges Dam, dates back to the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, and was actually delivered by one of the chief engineers of the Army Corps of Engineers of the US. And in fact, David Lilienthal even consulted for the nationalist government before Mao's revolution. And those plans sort of made their way through Mao's period, through Deng Xiaoping, all the way to modernity, and were delivered. And they didn't stop there. The Yangtze is being developed, much like the Tennessee Valley Authority had been in the 30s and 40s, with a variety of other pieces of infrastructure, Jilodu, Zanzibar, these massive pieces of infrastructure that have essentially transformed the landscape. And of course, today, China is exporting this model of development now across many developing countries. Now, remember that what happened, the story that started with public health in England, led to a focus on the landscape, and then drove development on the landscape for the better part of the century, ultimately has a kind of public health underwriting story beneath it, which is, the improvement in life expectancy, which of course is due to many things, penicillin, et cetera, but fundamentally starts when, John Snow at Broad Street makes this discovery. The Royal Commission is there. This is a picture of life expectancy in Britain and then in the United States. You then have the New Deal there, and of course the modernist projects that are spreading out there. And of course, remember that to this day, this idea that water and the development of the landscape is such an important and tied part of public health is still real. One of the three things that we all have to do in the COVID pandemic, aside from wearing a mask and keeping our distance from others, is washing our hands. Clean water and sanitation is still the primary public health intervention in the world. This experience was also profound from a cultural and constitutional perspective, and I'll come back to that, but I just wanted to, it's a long story, but I wanted to make this point, and so I thought I'd do it with a painting, because I think it captures in many ways the ethos and the idea at the time. So the painting is of a painter called Thomas Hart Benton. You see him there on the left-hand side. Today, he is mostly remembered as the first teacher of Jackson Pollock. But at the time, he was a famous, particularly in the 30s and 40s, he was a famous muralist and a commentator of kind of a social commentator, essentially. Some of his murals are in the New School. One of his murals was commissioned in 1947 for the building you see there on the right, which is Hertzfeld's store. It's a general store in Kansas City. And Kansas City, incidentally, is in the Mississippi Basin on the Kansas River, subject to endemic flooding. And what he ended up painting was this. This is a painting that today is at the Smithsonian called Achilles and Hercules, in reference to the Ovidian metamorphosis story. And this is really an allegory, I think, of the relationship between the state, the collective, and the landscape. You can see on the right there in the distance the steamboat that travels on the river, representing the sort of industrialization of agriculture, the proleptic horn of plenty, the cornucopia that carries all the agricultural goods that were produced by the Midwest, which were being sold to Europe under Reconstruction. Remember, this is the time of the Marshall Plan. Incidentally, the Marshall Plan at one point was thought would be called the Europe TVA, right? Just to give you a sense of how predominant this idea of modernization was. And then at the heart of the picture is this is Achilles, the river god that Ovid describes, turned himself into a bull to fight Hercules, which is here represented by these two identical bare-chested youths who actually in the allegory represent the Army Corps of Engineers, the executive branch of the territorial sovereignty of the American Federal Republic, as the rest of the population kind of looks on. And this really places that wrestling state with the forces of nature at the heart of the conception of the landscape of the 1940s and 50s. So the lesson we learn here is that we transformed the surface of the planet once before, probably on the scale that we're talking about today. It's a different type of transformation, I'm not arguing that it should be the same transformation. And of course, the climate wasn't changing at the time, but expectations were enough that they required change. And they were guided by epidemiology and, to some extent, economic theory. They were driven by powerful executive institutions which pursued the investments. And critically, the transformation was accompanied by a cultural and constitutional evolution. Okay, now the third and final lesson here. Therefore, institutions matter. And this is probably the thing that matters the most and is talked about the least. If you think about how the response to COVID was delivered, it relied on a complex set of institutions in the Douglass North sense of constraints on our economic and social norms. It relied on 100+ years of epidemiological practice from John Snow to today. It relied on capillary and trustworthy organizations of the public health system. And critically, it relied on a civic pact centered around public health. So in the last few minutes, let me just go through each of these and tell you where I think we are on the journey to sustainability, the journey that we are supposed to be starting with this recovery when compared to COVID. So first, the epistemology of public health. How do we know what we know about public health? Well, if you think about epidemiology, it's on display every evening and every week as the governments of the world sort of report on progress. And we have detailed tracking of health outcomes, which we all agree are defined in the same way. Detailed tracking geographically, demographically, in time. And of course, we've identified specific determinants, whether it's the virus or the treatment, right? The vaccines. And the causation that drives policy action is supported by a large epistemological body of tools that come from epidemiology, from randomized clinical trials all the way to kind of case reports and the Sir Bradford Hill's criteria, right? Now, if you compare that to where we are in sustainability, in the transition to a more sustainable economy, well, we're not nearly close to that. If you think about the planetary outcomes, of course, we have various frameworks, but the SDGs being one, for example, which is the symbol here. But if you think about how they're measured, many of them are not actual physical measurements of outcomes of the planet. They are measurements of activities. Did we do something? Not what happened on the planet. If you think about the determinants, the interventions that we're asking for, infrastructure, forest restoration and protection, or regenerative agriculture, we've identified many of those, and we do have impact assessments, of course, but we don't have a generalized practice of inferring causation on a large scale. We don't have populations and controlled trials on the same scale. Now, there are good reasons for that, and I don't have time to get into them, but what I'd like to say is that things may be changing because we are in the midst of a golden age of Earth observations. This is an image from NASA, and this allows us to measure what is happening on the planet and therefore the health outcomes of the planet, if you will, on a precision and a scale that we never had before. And so, for example, this is work that I've been involved with over the last few years at Nature Conservancy and with some other colleagues. We can now detect from space habitat condition, the actual conditions of habitats. So as opposed to reporting just on conservation activity, we can report on the physical state. And so, for example, in the east coast of the United States, in North Carolina, in its work that my very capable colleague Sheila Reddy has led, we can start distinguishing from space these types of ecosystems. On the top, you have a kind of a natural restored ecosystem. On the bottom, you have an unrestored ecosystem. The difference between these two required expert judgment till very recently, required sending somebody to measure. And now we can get a satellite image from space and have a convolutional neural network classify the pixels and essentially then classify them by outcome, by actual measured outcome on the planet. Another example is the very remarkable work that Alessandro Baccini at Boston University has done on directly measuring the carbon stock of above ground biomass. This is a critical step in making offsets real, right? We can't just measure leafage, we can't just measure forest cover, we have to measure the carbon stock, and we're now getting to the point where we're capable of measuring these very physical outcomes. Now, the second big part of the COVID response was an integrated ecosystem of public health organizations, the health system. This is a little map of the UK's health system. And you have this incredibly complex and dendritic system of commissioning agencies, provisioning institutions from primary to secondary care, regulators, advisors, all the way to the pharmaceutical industry, all of them tied by the epidemiology, by the language of epidemiology and the norms of healthcare. Now, if you think about the landscape issue and the problem of sustainability, this is an example from the Rio Grande, a place where I and other colleagues have worked on for some years. Well, the Rio Grande may look like an individual basin, just like the Tennessee Valley looked like an individual basin, or the Thermal Lake looked like an individual basin. But then when you look at the institutional structure that represents the ownership of land and landscape on this river basin, you see that it's incredibly fragmented. And for the most part, interventions that deliver sustainability these days are regulated by contract. It's one piece of infrastructure at a time. It's one piece of development at the time. And then lastly, the social contract. Now, on the health side, you will recognize that we've been housebound for several months now. And under rule of law systems, that is extremely rare to see people deprived of liberty without any trial. But the reason the governments of the world were able to do that, at least in common law and civil law systems that operate under the rule of law, is that modern constitutionalism, which is kind of the body of knowledge that describes the scope and limit of state power, really developed, and its product of Enlightenment, really developed at the same time as society was wrestling with smallpox and yellow fever pandemics. So we've had 200 years of judicial reviews in place that have metabolized the role of the state in delivering public health. If you think about the United States as an example, the idea that you can use police force to compel people to vaccinate was established by the Supreme Court in 1905 in Jakespin versus Massachusetts, which is over 100 years ago, right? We've had 100 years to metabolize the idea that public health is actually at the heart of our social contract. If you now look at where environmental constitutionalism, where do we place the environment? We are just at the beginning, right? This is a picture of where in the world, which countries in the world have actually adopted environmental provisions, environmental protection provisions in their constitutions. And, there was one country in 1948, Italy actually, which in its new Republican constitution had a provision for the protection of the landscape. And then in response to the environmental movements of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, a number of countries, particularly in civil law systems, adopted constitutional provisions for the protection of the environment, but these were mostly conservation intended, right? They were about protecting fragility in the environment, not about kind of the sustainability that will save us, right? Now, again, this is changing. I'll just mention in closing this one example. There's a case by a not-for-profit in Holland, in the Netherlands, Urgenda, who represented about 800 plaintiffs and brought the government to court because the Dutch government had failed to meet its emissions obligations. And as a result, because the Netherlands is a low-lying country, Urgenda argued this was a risk to the well-being of its plaintiffs. Now, this started as a case of tort law, but it went through 3 levels of judgment, reaching the Supreme Court of the Netherlands at The Hague in 2019. And by the time it got to the Supreme Court, it was actually a human rights case. The Supreme Court judged that on the basis of Articles 2 and 8 of the European Charter of Human Rights, that is, the articles that protect life and private life, the Dutch government had been negligent, and indeed it should be compelled to cut its emissions. And what's important here is that this process has constitutionalized the issue of the risks faced by the population from climate change. And more of these instances are coming on stream every year. So, in closing, 3 lessons for recovery and building resilience that I took from reflecting on the COVID pandemic. Number 1, a sustainable recovery will require national commitment to landscape transformation. It's a profound exercise of sovereignty that we're expecting our states and governments to do. Number 2, public health and economic imperatives have driven the transformation of the national landscape before, but there are a lot of ifs and buts to that, right? Think of the executive power of the institutions like the Tennessee Valley Authority. Think of the conflict and the constitutional transformation that was required. And then lastly, an effective response, and this I think is the most important lesson for the rebuilding story, requires a shared epistemology, requires that we understand what is happening at the same time in the same way, requires institutions that are capable of delivery at scale, and critically, I think, requires a constitutional settlement that accommodates the kind of authority that's required to make those changes happen. I will stop here. If you want to read more, some of the material is in a book that I've written and is published by Pantheon Books, part of Penguin Random House, which will come out in September. I also will be hopefully collaborating with a number of folks at Oxford on some of the themes that I've touched in here, and I want to thank the Smith School for hosting me in my time at Oxford. And with that, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Giulio, for a very stimulating talk. I'm sure the perspectives you advance will be quite novel to a lot of people, but on the other hand, also provides a framework that we're looking for people to understand what is the nature of the task of building back and what are the issues that need to be addressed. Just in terms of 1 or 2 follow-up questions. I mean, looking back, your material suggested there were some positives in terms of we have managed the enormous landscape projects or environmental projects before, the TVA being the iconic example. Similarly, if we look at COVID, again, there is a system that managed to respond, drawing on 100 years of institutional development. It had a lot of the pieces it needed in place. But if we look forward, and this began to show through in your slide when we got on to the Sustainable Development Goals, there seemed to be a sort of plus and minus. I mean, on the plus side, you flagged that, getting down to your epistemological point, we're last getting some technology which might allow us to get a handle on, measuring nature in a way that is the first step towards managing it. So that's the plus, that might be the new factor coming in. But on the other hand, on the institutional level, compared with the sort of focus of the New Deal or the consensus around public health, we've got a very that is a negative. So in many ways, it's almost as though success in this area is going to depends which wins out, whether the technology manages to get the information and the understanding in place sufficient to counter the institutional limitations.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, first of all, I should say that, the past to me is not, a source of sort of rote examples that one can apply. The TVA was problematic in many ways. And, the modernism of the 20th century has a number of drawbacks that I didn't have time to get into. But it does speak to the fact that those 3 levels that I was speaking to, the sort of epistemological level and the measurement, if you will, the institutional level and the constitutional and kind of political level, are a sort of a system, right? They work in tandem. And I think that where we are in sustainability today is that, my own opinion is that the crucial bottleneck for institutional innovation is the measurement. In other words, until we have a way of convincing ourselves of systematic causation, so that we, can invest in a piece of infrastructure or can invest in a conservation project and know systematically that will have the expected impact on let's call it the planetary health outcome that we are seeking. Until we have that, we won't be able to develop institutions that can be held accountable for those outcomes. So that's a particularly important advancement, which is why I think that the positives of that first, the technology, may hold some key to then provoking institutional innovation. The last thing I'll say on this, Marshall, is that we should note, however, that what I hope I've conveyed is that I think most of what needs to be happening is eminently geospatial. It's located somewhere. We will have to change things in places. Most of our economic models are not actually geospatially defined. We don't actually, our general equilibrium models don't really worry about where the investments happen. And so particularly in the economics profession, and I know there are some at Oxford that are thinking about this, are thinking about the geospatiality of investment, for example, and Caldecott and others. I think that it will be important to update those economic tools to reflect the geographic nature of what we are trying to do.
I mean, a related question goes back to the slide you showed that, first of all, showed the dramatic increase in resources that the one country, the UK, had managed to mobilize in response to COVID, when compared to the level of resources we've managed to mobilize in response to the need to address the sustainability agenda. And my point is, if we manage to get the level of resources up to a level that is clearly needed, we then have the issue of how to spend it, because we can obviously increase the amount of money we spend on research, which will increase the information. But as we know, research will not solve the political problems. I mean, go back to a point you made in a different context about Hannah Arendt. I mean, if you ask, the technical questions are couched in a language which limit the scope of the problem they can address. And so It's where do you think we could spend the balance of that money to begin to address the institutional issues?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that, so maybe 3 points. First of all, the comparison between global expenditures and the UK's national expenditure is sort of telling, but slightly unfair, in the sense that the UK is capable of mobilizing those kinds of resources because it has this massive hidden public balance sheet from which it can sort of draw finance, right? And so the comparison is not entirely fair, but it does give a sense of the difference between a sovereign state actually intervening and the resources that are put in play by programs that do not have the ability to finance their activity. Now, suppose we then did mobilize money on that scale, where would you spend it? I mean, I think that, hopefully, so two pieces to this. One is, there's a part of this that is not about money, and the Hannah Arendt point is a really important one. She was writing, when she wrote The Human Condition, the big problem was all these scientists who were developing the nuclear bomb, and the concern was that the language of mathematics that was used to describe those programs excluded the population from a political discussion about what to do about them. And I think we need to find a way of going beyond a technocratic plan in responding to sustainability, because I think, as I hope I've articulated, this is about what our home looks like, and it's an eminently political issue. This doesn't require a lot of money, but it does require a different type of language. We need to go beyond the "trust me, I have a PhD in climate sciences, therefore this is the answer." And there I'm relatively optimistic in that there is now an engagement on things like environmental justice that are politicizing the issue as it should be politicized, aside from what anyone sort of believes. Now, when you then get into the question of how you spend it, we have institutional architecture in place. I don't think we have to invent it from scratch. We have agricultural departments. I mean, if you think about the EU, half of its budget goes into agriculture. We have, in some cases, infrastructure ministries. In some cases, we have energy and mining ministries, right? So we have channels through which the government can provide subsidies or be a risk taker in new investments. But what's missing is the brain, is the coordination that will glue all of these together, just like the Department of Health glues together the health response of a rather complex and varied institutional framework.
Okay, thanks very much. I'd like to move on now and introduce the two panelists we've got to ask you some questions. The thinking behind the composition of the panel was quite simple. We're very conscious of the fact we have 600 postgraduates in Green Templeton College, a lot of whom are studying in areas that are related to or reflect their direct interest in sustainability. So I've asked two of them to come and join us this evening. And the first, Alex Midland, is doing his doctorate research here. And the second is Laura Sanchez, who is doing an MPhil research area in development. So I'm going to ask them in turn to just briefly introduce themselves and then ask the questions that have occurred to them. So, Alex, perhaps you could lead off, please.
Thank you very much, Marshall. And Giulio, thank you very much indeed for your presentation, really fascinating. I've returned to academia after a career in local government and environmental planning, and I'm now studying for a DPhil in marine environmental governance. In terms of my question, you've already talked quite a lot in responding to Marshall about spending. And it seems to me that in the pandemic, many governments have really struggled in managing the trade-offs inherent in crisis-based decision-making. And that seems to me to be essentially a political question. I'm wondering what hopes you have that they'll do any better in relation to the climate and biodiversity crises, because it really seems to me that politics rather than institutions are failing us at this present time.
Yeah, it's an important point, and it's as with all good questions, is a complicated issue, right? I do think that the response of countries has been quite varied. We've not had uniformly bad responses, nor the same mistakes done everywhere. And I would note that one of the differentiators has been experience. Countries that have had to deal with SARS and MERS before showed a fair amount of experiential knowledge in dealing with this. And it wasn't just about the delivery, the institutional knowledge in the sort of delivery institution, but it was also about the social acceptance of the type of, and therefore the political legitimacy of the choices that had to be made. If you'd gone through SARS before, you probably were much more prone to accepting the idea that your freedoms would have to be curtailed. I am optimistic. I mean, I sometimes think that we have unrealistic expectations. We sort of tend to think, oh, if only politics wouldn't get in the way. And I think that's a sort of mistake, because politics is kind of important. I think it's where the different values of a more of a varied society and are represented and mediated and negotiated, right? And so some of the mistakes, if there are mistakes, can be brought down to experience. But some of the politics that has slowed down response or have made it complicated are to be expected. In some ways, I am looking forward to the time when we'll have sufficiently salient conversations about a sufficient amount of money that those conversations will become real. I think we're getting closer. I think governments are making more and more commitments, but I can promise you that if we start spending a couple £100 billion in a year on some of the issues that we face, like coastal resilience, for example, which I know, Alex, you think about a lot, at that point those political issues come to the fore, and that's entirely natural and right. And so, it's an imperfect answer, but I agree with you that the political level is the critical one. I do not think that the complexity of navigating political negotiations is a disease. I think it's the nature of problems that matter.
Perhaps, Laura, you could introduce yourself and see what questions you'd like to raise.
Sure. So my name is Dore. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much both. Thank you so much for the talk. And my name is Dore. I'm in the second year MPhil in development studies, and I started Green Recovery Now, which is the Oxford University student-led movement. And basically what we do is we use high-quality research to support a global green and fair recovery from COVID-19, and by raising awareness and also by putting pressure on governments in the future. And it was inspired by the Smith School paper that you actually also mentioned, and it's received the support of GTC. And it has different teams. Now we are like approximately 30 people in 7 different teams, and we are growing, actively growing. So a question would be, you mentioned the NGO Urgenda, like the case, and you have spoken about state accountability and about engaging grassroots. So what role do you think that social movements play to argue for government action and to put pressure on governments to adopt climate-friendly policies to recover from COVID-19? I know it's very context-specific, depending on the country and the government, but what are your general thoughts about this? Thanks.
Yeah, well, thank you, Laura. It's an important question, and obviously a complicated one, and in some ways we'll find out, because a lot of the environmental activism that's emerged over the last couple of years is quite different in nature from the environmental movement, in all positive ways, by the way, from the environmental movements that emerged out of the 60s and 70s, which was in a way kind of inspired by a particular brand of conservationism and environmentalism that had roots in, European romanticism and sort of the American West, right? That was the dominant paradigm. Whereas now we see a lot more of what people refer to as intersectionality, where you worry about environment, but you worry environment in the context of justice issues, in the context of equity issues, and so forth, so on. And so that, in a way, is a maturing, in my view, of the environmental movement, because it brings the environmental movement back in political discourse. Now, the question is, we will need an equivalent maturing on other parts of the political spectrum, right? If we're going to actually have a real debate about this, and so I think I'm cautiously optimistic. I think engagement of young people, engagement of different different constituencies in society is important. I hope there will be more, and there will be more diversity in it. So that's one observation. The second observation is, I do think that modernity has detached us to a large part from the landscape. And so we're no longer used to thinking of negotiations between urban populations and rural populations as central to political discourse. And this is a really new phenomenon until, maybe the 1950s, 60s. I mean, certainly, I come from Italy. Even in the 60s and 70s in Italy, that was still an issue. But today we kind of imagine ourselves completely divorced from the landscape. You open your tap in your kitchen and you have no conception of where that water actually comes from in the landscape. And most people don't have to wade a river going to work, and therefore think that we just live in a world of cement. And I think that one of the challenges of the environmental sustainability agenda is that it says, if I'm right, that landscape is going to have to be back at the heart of political negotiation. What we do with where we live is going to be a salient, in fact, a principal political issue. And the political representation doesn't really map onto that very well. So giving voice to constituencies that are particularly vulnerable to choices that have to do with the landscape is really important. And I'm not entirely convinced that modern political parties have yet been able to intercept those kind of claims. And so in that sense, civil society plays an additional important intermediating role, which is to capture the needs of particular constituencies that are particularly susceptible to landscape-based issues and potentially solutions.
Okay, any more questions from Alex or Law?
I've got one just to follow up on that point, if I may. Giulio, you mentioned earlier your view on the importance of measurement and investing in data gathering and so on. And whilst I do share that view, I see a couple of issues with it, really. I think one is that if we're using that to as a means to persuade, to influence the politics, so we get policy going in the right direction, we first of all need to be investing in a much, much greater scale in gathering data than we are now. And of course, that money comes from political decision making. So there seems to be a bit of a catch-22 there. Secondly, I think that increasingly, as we make more use of data in policy making, there's a lot of critique now around the fact that data feeds into very technocratic processes with which local communities have a great deal of difficulty engaging. And there's talk of post-political processes of state-led planning, which really close out a lot of the fundamental discussions that we've been talking about this evening.
Yeah. Another good question. You guys have complex questions that require more than a few minutes to deal with. But let me attempt to make a couple of comments on that. So first of all, yes, I mean, I'm not a kind of political scientist by training, and I think that there's a lot to be said about kind of what is the theory of the state in this picture that I'm painting, right? And that warrants sort of another conversation. I think if you take the COVID response as a model, all of those elements are there too, right? I mean, you have incredibly sophisticated data that needs to be used to make decisions. For the most part, we accept them. They don't eliminate, the data doesn't eliminate the fundamental problems of, do I keep a pub open and people employed, or do I save the people in a retirement home, right? I mean, there are profound existential choices that are not actually technical in nature. They're sort of existential in nature, right? And so those don't go away because you're dealing with sophisticated data and a sophisticated epistemology. But I would also add that one of the things that makes a huge difference in the healthcare debate is that everybody has a GP and everybody has a doctor and experiences the public health system directly. And so there's a level of experience and trust that it doesn't really happen when you're talking about planning infrastructure or you're planning landscape development. I mean, some of the countries, the US, the UK, others, used to have, when they were agrarian societies, extension services, which were the equivalent of the sort of healthcare system today. Some countries like India and others still have them, but we don't have anything like that, right? So where does the individual experience of these problems come? And in the case of health, you have this kind of dendritic capillary system that touches everybody at least once a year, whereas in the case of sustainability, it can be quite removed. So I think that's one kind of critical difference that needs to be solved. That said, I do think that it's important. I mean, it's ironic that I say this in living in the UK, but I am a Republican in the sense of I believe in sort of the fact that we need Republican principles to govern a social contract. We live in a civic pact here, and we need institutions to help us drive collective action. And so, in that sense, I don't have a particular problem with the idea that some degree of state planning is required. I just think it needs to be politically supervised, and that's, I think, where the kind of difficulty resides.
Okay, finally, any last points before I wrap up?
Yeah, I think what do you think would be the how could the relationship between research institutions and civil society institutions be strengthened to precisely kind of engage more with the population in terms of making the research more appealing for the population, or trying to explain it better when it comes to like climate-friendly policies to recover from COVID-19? Or what do you think how can that relationship be?
Yeah. Well, there are two answers to that, Laura, which, on the one hand, I think, and again, healthcare in a way is an interesting analogy, because we worry about health education all through the schooling system. So the schooling system is part of the delivery mechanism that ensures that people understand that they ought to trust the health system, right? And so I think that there's this question of how do you provide translations at different levels of that sophisticated epistemology that we were talking about, so that people in society can access it at different levels, right? So that's a crucial function for educational institutions. Now, for the research institutions, I think there are, I like Alex, actually, I've worked in conservation, and I have worked in conservation for a number of years, and we have a real problem in environmental discussions, which is we sort of, we're still in a sort of propaganda mode. Everything works. You should always invest in nature. You should always invest in green. And the fact is that, as we all know, if something works all the time, it's probably not real. And we need research institutions to hold performance accountable to fact. So, for example, I would note that there are very few ex post studies of the performance of infrastructure around the world. And so, for example, people are against dams. There's lots of debate about how you should develop rivers, something I've been intimately involved in for a number of years. But the fact of the matter is there are very, very few economically sound ex post assessments of what the impact has been. One famous one was done by the late Ramesh Bhatia at the World Bank 15 years ago, trying to understand what the impact of the big dams in a number of developing countries had been. But it's a rare instance, and it's actually not, it didn't produce a shared view of what what the answer is. And so I think research institutions have a really important role to play in holding us accountable to the truth. What does actually work? And a key indicator of the fact that you have the answer is that you also know when it doesn't. Until everything works all the time, I suspect we haven't landed on the right answer.
Okay, well, I think the clock has beaten us, and so it just remains to me to thank Giulio for a very stimulating talk. The material you covered was fascinating to me, and I'm sure it will be to our wider audience. And also to thank you for handling what you rightly termed complex questions so well. I think we were all trying to get a handle on what is a complex situation. But I'm also delighted that from what I gather, you'll be spending more time with us in Oxford, and we'll have a chance, certainly with our research students at the Smith School, to work with you some more and get the benefit of your extensive knowledge and experience. So thanks very much to Giulio, and thanks very much to Alex and Law. And now I'll hand over to Sir Michael, the principal.
Thank you, Marshall. I'm grateful to a great many people at Green Templeton College and at Franklin Templeton, along with their technical partners, for making today's event possible. I'm also particularly grateful to our speaker, Giulio Boccaletti, for his thought-provoking presentation. Thank you very much indeed. It's my hope that the development of this sort of relationship with a corporate partner benefits both the college and all the other involved parties. At Green Templeton College, we value the opportunity to share knowledge and expertise with Franklin Templeton and hope to continue to benefit together from this sort of collaboration into the future. I think the lectures themselves have demonstrated the strength of the existing relationship between the college and Franklin Templeton, and I'm very much looking forward to the final part of the series. Thank you very much.